The wind comes first, a dry, relentless breath that abrades the voice down to truth. It tugs at the sage and lays the grass flat, and if you stand very still, you can hear it comb the land for anything loose. An old cartridge case, a dropped spur rowel, a secret. Out here, the horizon is a long blade. A man learns to read it the way a town man reads a ledger. Tom Horn learned to read tracks before he had the right to call himself a man. He left Missouri young, shed boyhood on the trail like a snake leaves its skin, and came into the deserts and mountains where the U.S. Army chased Apache raiding parties across a border sketched more by politics than by water or rock. He wasn't commissioned, not even enlisted. He was the sort of hand the Army always seemed to find: civilian packer, interpreter when needed, scout when things got hot. By 1881, he was in the Southwest for real. No dime novel bravado, just the grind of moving mules, hauling cartridges and hardtack, and watching the sun like a clock that never lies. The records and payrolls say so. The boasting came later. The work that mattered was simpler and more dangerous. Tracking was a language of its own. A scuffed pebble that shouldn't be scuffed, a mesquite leaf twisted the wrong way, a heel scab with marl, sign. Horn learned to see at distance and to wait without moving. He learned where the shadows would be at noon a week from Thursday. He learned Spanish because you had to, and he learned that the border could go soft and treacherous, like alkali crust you step through to drown. In the last cold months of 1885, scouting under Captain Emmett Crawford, he followed Apache scouts deep into Sonora on a chase that seemed to repeat the same day over and over. Dust, hoof, spoor, nothing, until the day the wrong uniforms appeared and history kinked. They call it the Crawford Affair now, clean and remote, but it wasn't clean when the shots came in near Nacarichico on January 11, 1886. Mexican militia blundered into an American-led scout camp. Parley tried to grow out of the confusion like a fragile sprout. Then someone squeezed a trigger and the desert answered. Crawford fell. Horn took a round through the arm. The scouts were scattered in bad country with a dead commander, and the diplomats would take months to do what the men on the ground did quickly: find water, stop bleeding, and get out with their skins intact. The fight left a gouge across the campaign and nearly widened into an international quarrel. Horn himself left a sworn statement that winter to the U.S. State Department, lean as a saddle strap, telling his part and only his part. If a man survives such things, he comes away with a smaller appetite for speeches and a larger respect for calculation. The Army's hunt wore on, columns inching and doubling back, scouts feeling their way through canyons that folded like paper fans, until the endgame in the Pelanchillos. Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, Apache speaking and narrow as a whip, pushed a peace message across a battlefield that had no clear edges. Geronimo, worn thin by months of pressure, made his last bargain with fate. On September 4, 1886, in Skeleton Canyon, he surrendered to General Nelson Miles. Horn rode in those shadows, one of the men who kept the pressure and closed the distance. When the last rifles fell silent, an age of war snapped off like a dry twig. The frontier doesn't stop when the bugles do. It narrows. The wide license of campaigning gives way to the smaller license of paymasters and contracts. Horn had built himself a kit of skills. He could ride long and shoot straight, cross bad ground with animals and men still following, and sift lies from noise. He also had a memory for grudges, against thieves, against the looseness that lets a man take what isn't his and ride away laughing. The lesson of the Apache campaign, written in his bones, was that patience and distance beat romance every time. Get above your enemy. Let him step into your range. Do the thing once, cleanly. In the 1890s, that craft could be sold. Pinkerton's National Detective Agency, the great private arm of the age, brought Horn on for rough country work out of Denver, hunting train robbers and range bandits who prided themselves on vanishing into gulches, too mean for sheriffs to love. Horn did what he was told and sometimes more. The line between detective and deterrent blurred with every job where just being seen in a valley made nesters hitch their teams and load their wagons. He was the sort of man whose reputation rode a mile ahead of him, and in the west of banks and railroads and foreign capital ranches, that was sometimes all the law a company thought it needed. Then war flared in a different latitude. In 1898, when the United States went to war with Spain, Horn found himself reattached to an army of a new stripe as chief packer for the 5th Corps. It was another education. Cuba was heat and mud, yellow jack, and sudden gunfire. Pack trains are the arteries of a fight. Choke them, and the heart fails. Horn supervised strings of mules through swales, where a misstep meant a broken leg and starvation, under fire that came from palms and ditch lines, and he kept them moving. He wasn't a hero in the way newspapers preferred, but soldiers at the crest of San Juan and the long scrape along Kettle Hill found ammunition on their belts, and that mattered more than adjectives. When the fever came through the camps like a thief, Horn took his turn in bed, then stood back up and finished the job. He came home with the same quiet as before, and a broader proof that logistics wins battles even when the flag is in front. When he returned stateside at the war's end, the map had changed less than the market. The big outfits, some backed by Scottish capital, some by Eastern syndicates, had counted sheep and calves and grass, and concluded that order on the open range could not be left to overworked county lawmen riding a docket in a tired gelding. Swan Land Cattle Company, for example, had once grazed tens of thousands of head on millions of acres. Even after the hard winter of 1886-87, its shadow lay across Wyoming like weather. These were the employers who wanted a man who could cut sign, keep his mouth shut, and produce results that showed up on a balance sheet. They called the job stock detective. Others called it something colder. If Horn worried about the names men used, he didn't show it. He had learned on the San Bernardino and in the Peloncillos that clear sight and a steady hand solved problems quicker than meetings. He favored the 30-30 lever rifle not for romance, but because it worked. Flat enough shooting for country where the distances were deceptive, dependable enough to travel hard. He preferred to warn first, or so he later said. He believed that a thief who had been fairly warned and kept stealing had declared his own verdict. Whether that belief was justice or rationalization is a question the plains have never stopped asking. And so the scout crossed the last invisible boundary and became a range detective the way a night finally, fully becomes dawn. Not all at once, but inevitably. You can still feel that pivot if you stand on a ridge where cattle trails braid into sheep tracks and the wind shreds voices before they reach a neighbor's porch. The old wars were over. The new ones had different uniforms. Horn had the patience to wait in greasewood until his quarry stood where the line of sight was true. He had the languages, Spanish for the border, trail slang for the cow camps, silence for the chewing tobacco talk of men who never said more than they had to. He had the habit of distance. Shoot from far enough away that the future has time to arrive before the echo does. History would later argue about when exactly he became the thing his enemies said he was. But in the late 1890s, the man who had walked unarmed into a dangerous parley in Sonora, who had watched the last Apache rifles stack in a hot, narrow canyon, and who had threaded mule strings through Cuban heat, was back on the high plains with a new brief. Protect the herds of men powerful enough to hire peace the way other men buy salt. The storm clouds for Brown's Park were already rising, where 3 states drift together like smoke. The notes tacked to cabin doors were still only rumors. The rifle was oiled. The wind, as ever, was blowing toward trouble. By the 1890s, the West had traded raw edges for ledgers. Railroads stitched territories to markets. Bank vaults replaced saddlebags for keeping score. Wherever there was money in motion, payrolls, shipments, cattle on the hoof, someone hired men to make the sums add up. Tom Horn slipped easily into that arithmetic. Pinkerton's Denver office took him on at the turn of the decade. Not for desk work, but for the kind of fieldcraft that doesn't show in a clerk's hand. Long saddles, cold camps, a knack for appearing exactly where a fugitive thought the world had gone empty. The agency liked results and Horn obliged, operating in that half-lit zone where the client's interest and public law overlapped just enough to shake hands. Pinkerton work meant following iron trails and rumor trails at once. A holdup on the right-of-way was as much a wound to reputation as to pocketbook, and railroad men paid to have the bleeding stopped. In Colorado's backcountry, the tracks ran through cuts and curves that made ambush into a science. Horn rode those corridors, gathering names like a prospector pans flecks from a stream. The story that he and another agent ran down the Cotopaxi bandits without firing a shot says less about luck than about pressure. applied precisely at distance until a door opened and a pair of men decided prison was better than dying in their own front yard. Whether every detail is as neat as the legend, the record is plain enough. The Denver and Rio Grande's troubles drew Pinkerton's, and Pinkerton's drew Tom Horn. Pinkerton life also taught him the politics of memory. When the press wanted a name, the agency preferred its own. When a court wanted a confession, the agency preferred a conviction. Horn fit that culture, tight-lipped, useful, and hard to shake. He could be reckless in saloons, iron in the field. That paradox dogs men who are paid to be feared. The same appetite for risk that makes them essential can stain the record they serve. Even so, his reputation began to travel ahead of him, like the dust off a fast horse. The effect was measurable. In camps where a whisper of his presence went around, the number of men thinking about taking what wasn't theirs seemed to dip. Fear as policy, vulgar, effective, profitable. Then came a different kind of assignment. The army again, but under a new flag and in another climate. In the summer of 1898, Horn joined the U.S. Fifth Corps in Cuba as Chief Packer, a title that sounds bureaucratic until you picture the job. Mules shoved along clay roads that turned to soup under afternoon rain. Crates of rifle ammunition that had to be where the rifles were, not an hour later. Fever stalking the ranks as stealthily as snipers did. Logistics wins battles, and Horn, no romantic, no fool, pushed the strings forward because men uphill needed cartridges more than they needed oratory. The paperwork says Chief Packer, but the work was grit and improvisation during and after the fights east of Santiago. When he came back, he had the same quiet as before, and one more proof that discipline under misery is the only courage that lasts. Home again, he found the Old West had been shorn close, fenced in places where a man once could ride 3 days without seeing a post. The big outfits had learned their winter lessons. The blizzards of '86, '87 had humbled even the powerful and sharpened their arithmetic. If nature could be that cruel to prophets, imagine what a handful of clever thieves could do. So the ranch corporations professionalized their defense. Minutes were kept, fees assessed, detectives hired. It had begun decades earlier. Stock associations levying dues to pay men to discourage rustlers. But the 1890s gave that impulse new teeth. Where sheriffs were overworked or overmatched, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and its peers filled the vacuum with private eyes and public influence. Horn, with his Pinkerton schooling and campaign patience, was exactly the tool a boardroom could understand. If the Johnson County War was the loudest proof of how far the cattle kings would go, it was also a kind of syllabus for what followed. Private trains, hired guns, lists of names, and a cavalry intervention that hushed the immediate scandal, but cured nothing. The lesson taken by those who wrote checks was blunt: don't lose again. And the lesson taken by men like Horn was blunter still: fight smarter, quieter, farther from witnesses. The invasion north in April 1892 was theater. The balance of the decade favored methods that left fewer headlines and more empty homesteads. Horn learned as much from that moment as he had from Skeleton Canyon. Power prefers silence. It was in this climate that the Swan Land Cattle Company, an empire in its own right, loomed like a weather system over southeastern Wyoming and northern Colorado. At its height earlier in the boom, Swan's leases and customary ranges touched millions of acres and nearly 100,000 head. Even after hard winters and lean years, its brand cast a long shadow. Such an outfit did not hire a man like Tom Horn for detective novels. It hired him to make sure that, season after season, more calves wearing its mark made it to market than not. If that meant quietly discovering who was shifting brands or drifting cattle across invisible lines, that was called range protection. If fear did the work cheaper than prosecutions, a manager was expected to count that as a saving. Horn's method hardened in these years into something with the geometry of a habit. He preferred the 30-30 lever gun, not for romance, but because its reach suited the open country. He liked high ground, cross winds he could read, and dawn when a camp is slow and eyes are gummy. Residents remembered a polite stranger asking about hay prices, a horse buyer with patient questions, a hand who rolled a cigarette on a cabin step and let other men talk first. They remembered the notes too, written in a plain, ugly hand and tacked to doors. Leave in 30 days, or the range will be quieter without you. Some called it procedure, others terror. Horn, when he boasted at all, would say the warning was the moral line, the thing that made what followed an enforcement rather than a murder. You could see in that belief the scout's old ethic. Give a man a chance to move before you press him against the ravine. The West noticed. In cow towns and county seats, editors learned to write around names while their readers filled in the blanks. In Denver, the Pinkertons still kept a desk for Horn when railroads needed a reminder. In Cheyenne, cattlemen measured his worth in subtler numbers. Fewer strays, fewer new cabins on disputed creeks, fewer herds dwindling on the margins. If hired law is a confession that public law has failed, the ledger men did not blush. They called it efficiency. The families who loaded their wagons at dusk called it something else. Not every employer left a clean trail through the books, but enough paper survives to show a system at work. Stock associations assessing members for detective fees, committees formed to address depredations, telegrams from managers impatient for outcomes. In that bureaucracy of control, Horn was the solvent. He dissolved problems. He had backers with names you could engrave on a bank cornice, and he had critics who were simply outlived by the corporations they defied. The soil itself seemed to take sides. Short grass that loved cattle over sheep, coolies that hit a rifleman better than a sheriff could hide his intentions. By the end of the decade, the man who had once moved mule strings through Cuban mud now moved like a rumor through the borderlands of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah. His face little known and his work widely felt. One more truth bit into him in the 90s. Power buys quiet. The Johnson County invaders found themselves photographed and guarded by soldiers. The next generation preferred to buy time, not spectacle. Men like Ora Haley, ranch magnates with deep pockets and longer horizons, had no taste for headlines if a letter and a long-range solution would do. A detective with Horn's patience could make a valley shiver without firing a shot. He could also make it bleed and leave nothing but echo. The smallholders took the hint. Some stayed and set their teeth. Many hitched teams and left before the snow came. On paper, the range looked safer. In the cabins left behind, the coffee boiled for no one. Albany County Historical Society. So the decade closes on a man in full possession of his uses. Pinkerton polish when a railroad needed official language. Brand iron law when a cattle empire wanted outcomes that courts could not guarantee. He had turned patience into doctrine, distance into mercy's opposite. The saddle creaked the same as it had in Sonora. The light at dawn still laid its long silver blade across the ridges. But his employers wore neckties now and counted in columns. Brown's Park lay just ahead, with its canyon wind and its nettlesome loyalties, and the name Tom Hicks waited like a shadow he would step into. Somewhere on a rough table in a one-room cabin, a pencil was freshly sharpened for a note that would change a valley. They called it Brown's Park, though the Green River did most of the painting, laying a green ribbon through red rock and willow, braiding oxbows where elk grazed and geese stitched their shadows to water. It was a valley made for hiding and for staying found only by those who deserved to. The border there was three-faced: Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and men learned early that if one state grew curious, you could step sideways into another and let curiosity cool. Outlaws used it. So did ranchers who loved their independence more than they loved a deed. So did Tom Horn. He did not arrive with a flourish, only with a plain horse, a bedroll, and a name that wasn't quite his, Tom Hicks. He said little and said it gently, buying hay here, talking horseflesh there, the way a man does who expects to stay a while without being noticed. Brown's Park could smell a deputy at 2 counties in a day's ride, but a cook could get work anywhere, and a horse buyer could always ask a few questions without stirring dust. In the saloons and cook shacks, strangers introduced themselves by the work their hands do. Horn's hands did all the right work, mending tack, splitting kindling clean, minding stock as if it belonged to him. The questions he asked were never exactly about brands, but they took the long way around to brands. Rustling as gossip, drifted cattle as weather, who'd bought a new Winchester as neighborly concern. A valley isn't just geography, it is alliances, marriages, old feuds that graze side by side with the cattle. Here the names mattered. Ann Bassett, young and sharp-eyed, ran cattle and opinions with equal ease. Queen Anne, some called her, for the way she took her ground and kept it. She was engaged to Matt Rash, a local cattlemen's association leader, whose temper was mostly held in the corners of his mouth, a quiet man whose word carried more than some men's shouts. The power that flowed in from the plains had other names: company buyers, stock detectives, distant boards counting calves on paper, and expecting obedience without ever tasting the alkali grit that came home on a man's tongue at day's end. Between those forces stood Isom Dart, a black cowboy as good a hand as any in the valley, long dogged by the charge that he'd turned rustler when the grass got tight. Old stories said his earlier name had been Ned Huddleston, and that he'd ridden with rough company. Newer tellings would argue with that, combing courthouse records and cemetery lists, insisting the past had been misfiled. What nobody disputed was Dart's horsemanship and the easy tilt of his grin when a job went right. In that tangle of loyalties, the notes began to appear. They were not eloquent nor misspelled enough to be dismissed. A simple hand, a simple demand: leave in 30 days. The wording changed from door to door, cabin to cabin, but the pressure behind the strokes did not. If a man had the money to move his herd, he could pretend he'd planned to winter elsewhere. If he did not, the note stared from the lintel like a curse. The valley had known warnings before: fence cuttings, gate wires twisted, a heifer shot from spite. But the formal cruelty of paper nailed where a wife would find it at dawn was new to some. It made a man's coffee bitter before the pot had finished perking. Horne's doctrine, if you can call it that, claimed the warning was the line between detective work and murder. Give a thief fair notice, he sometimes said later, and if that thief kept stealing, what followed was enforcement. Nothing personal, as if the bullet were as impersonal as weather. The valley did not argue philosophy, it counted funerals. On July 8, 1900, Matt Rash was shot near his cabin. The day had begun as so many days do. Chores, a glance at the sky, a saddle creaking under the familiar weight of a man who trusts his country and the habits that keep him safe within it. The ambush made a liar of those habits. Ann Bassett would remember that day with a kind of flinty clarity for the rest of her life. The grief braided into the defiance that already lived in her spine. There were no witnesses who lived to tell it. There were the tracks, the angle of a shot, the silence afterward, and the way suspicion pooled quickly around the polite stranger who had asked too many sensible questions and listened too well to the answers. 3 months later, on October 3, 1900, Isom Dart went down in the first light outside his place. The morning thin and chilly, the air full of the ordinary sounds that make a ranch morning: a hinge squealing, a horse blowing, a kettle lid rattling on a boil that would never be breakfast. The shot came from a man who understood range and patience. Dart fell, and with him fell a kind of laughter in Brown's Park. Not merriment exactly, but that relief men feel when a story tells against the powerful and gives the small man a day's advantage. That laughter went out of the valley. In its place came careful speech and the sound of wagons packing. Blame is a living thing on the frontier, moving faster than proof and settling heavier than verdicts. Those who had loved Rash and worked alongside Dart said Tom Hicks had a real name, and it was Tom Horn, and that he had earned his pay. Those who wrote the checks did not say much at all, and the sheriffs, confronted with a 3-state chessboard and a wall of silence thick as juniper, could not make arrests out of rumors. The company men counted strays like prayers answered. The small ranchers counted children and bedrolls and decided to take their chances somewhere else, where the river did not wind so many ways and the shadows were not quite so long at dawn. The newspapers said what they safely could. They printed the facts of death and the sketches that make a stranger handsome or wicked, depending on the angle of the jaw and the woodcut artist's mood. In back rooms and bunkhouses, the talk filled in the rest. A rifleman lying up in rocks, breathing with the sage, a bead taken across a distance a judge would never walk to see for himself. If a man wanted to believe in justice purchased by subscription, he called it cleaning up a nest of thieves. If he had sat at Rash's table or trailed a herd alongside Dart, he called it a killing paid for with a company's pen. The valley's demography changed in weeks. A place that had balanced independence and community, like a rider balancing a green-broke horse, began to tilt. Cabins went empty, chimneys went cold. Fences that had required neighbors' hands to stretch them went slack for lack of those hands. Ann Bassett stayed, of course. She had the stubbornness of a cottonwood growing through stone and the friends to back her when the wind blew wrong. But even stubbornness accepts arithmetic in the end. When enough families took the note seriously, there were fewer eyes to see and fewer voices to contradict the men who said all of this was necessary. Horn, if it was Horn, did not boast publicly. Men like him seldom do at the time. Boasting belongs to memoirs, and even then, it tends to bend the truth until it fits the holster. He likely wrote out the way he wrote in, quiet, checking cinches, leaving only the ordinary tracks of a man who knows that ordinary tracks are the safest ones to leave. In some tellings, he was already looking north toward work that would pay better and deliver more certain praise from those who never had to touch the consequences. In others, he simply drifted, because drifting is what a certain kind of man does when the work is finished. What remains from Brown's Park, after the affidavits and reminiscences have been sifted and resifted, is a valley's mood hardening like winter ground. The murders were never laid at Horn's feet in court, and yet the shape of them fits his method the way a saddle fits a horse used to its rider. Warning first, distance next, silence last. It is a sequence you can feel in your bones when you stand on a low ridge above a willow bottom and listen for hoofbeats that will never come because the men who made those hoofbeats have gone. The river still braids the green, the geese still pin their shadows to water, and the wind still combs the valley for anything loose enough to take. Men too, if they don't hold tight to whatever is left. Was Brown's Park order restored or freedom erased? It depends on which brand you rode for, which table you ate at, and whether the knock you heard after dark was a neighbor wanting help with a calving heifer, or the tap of a hammer driving a note into your doorframe, telling you the range would soon be quieter without you. The year ended with the leaves off the cottonwoods and 2 graves that drew the living into separate circles. The snow came. The tracks, as always, did not last. But the fear did, and fear is better at keeping books than any man with a pen. Somewhere beyond the canyon's shadow, a different feud was ripening under another sky. Iron Mountain, and a boy who would not live to see his 15th year. Whatever Horn did or did not do in Brown's Park, the next valley would teach him, in all of Wyoming, that even a perfect shot cannot be made clean when the world watching it is already split down the middle. The wind turned and carried the lesson north. The valley went back to its work. The rest of the story rode on. The Iron Mountain country north of Cheyenne is not iron at all, but baked clay and granite knobs shouldered up out of grass. In July, the wind shimmers there, and heat lifts off the flats like ghosts. Sheep bells carry farther than a man's voice, and the line between one man's graze and another's grievance is fine as a wire. On the morning of July 18, 1901, a boy rode out into that shimmer on routine business, mending, checking, being useful the way ranch children learn to be before they have outgrown the saddle that first fit them. His name was Willie Nickell, 14, son of a sheep man in a district that leaned cattle. He would not come home alive. The Nickells had neighbors, and among neighbors a feud, the sort of slow-burning quarrel that starts with water and grass and grows teeth. Fences had been cut, tempers sharpened, and threats sent into the air like thistles. The neighboring Miller clan worked cattle and carried their own list of injuries and slights. None of it was theatrical, just persistent. A gate found open that should have been shut, a ewe with a bullet as explanation, a word offered in public with a blade under it. In such country, brand and ban, cattle or sheep, could stand in for a man's character, and men obliged by acting as their animals were reputed to act. Cattlemen stubborn, sheepmen encroaching, each sure the other was ending the West as it ought to be. What happened to Willie felt like a verdict handed down by a quarrel grown careless. He was found not far from the family place, shot and fallen among the homely things that define a ranch morning: posts, dust, the clatter of a loose hinge. Some said he was wearing his father's coat, that a killer aiming to cut the root of the feud took a child instead. Others said the boy had been marked precisely because killing a child carries a message the living do not misread. The sheriff followed a story written in tracks and brass. The scuff of a horse where a horse should not have waited so long. The imprint of boots that knew to step in old prints. The 30-30 that writes its own punctuation. The land remembers in its own way. It remembered a rifle in a distance and a man who had patience enough to let an opportunity ripen. If the Valley South had taught Tom Horn anything, it was how to become the gravity around which suspicion orbits. His name surfaced almost at once, traveling faster than any warrant, because people in that country already believed in the existence of a certain kind of man, one paid to quiet problems from far away. Horn was not there to be seen when Willie fell, but men swore they could feel his manner in the work. Warning, range, silence. The sheriff listened because sheriffs must. The cattle interest nodded because nodding costs nothing. The sheepmen grieved because grief is what follows the shot. The country divided along lines that were older than the boy who had just died. The investigation stumbled, as frontier investigations often do, between skill and luck. The caliber was easy. Wyoming was full of Winchester Model 1894, 30-30s, righteous tools for a big land, and the terrain told a careful reader where a patient rifleman would lie to count fence wires and breaths, to take a shot between gusts. But this was 1901, and the art of tying a bullet to a barrel by its scars and striations was more hope than science. A man could say with authority that two bullets looked alike the way two storms do. He could not prove beyond doubt that they were the same. What investigators could say, what they did say, was that the killer had used a common rifle, had chosen his ground like a professional, and had left little but trajectory and absence behind. Suspicion is a tool when you know how to use it. Months later, in January 1902, a deputy U.S. Marshal named Joe LeFors set a trap with conversation. He dangled the promise of steady work before Horn, fancy detective business for a wealthy stockman, and invited him to talk it over in a Cheyenne office, upstairs where the cold couldn't bite and whiskey could. Horn came in off a night that had already seen its share of alcohol and brag, a man with the ease of someone who has too often been told he is useful. He did not know there was a stenographer in the next room, a human wire recorder taking down syllables the way a camera takes light. He did not know there were witnesses set to measure his words against their hunger for a conviction. Stories differ about the degree of Horn's drunkenness, a haze or a hammerlock, and they differ about the glint in LeFors' eye, professional or pleased. They agree mostly on the shape of what followed. Horn spoke broadly of the Iron Mountain shot, as men will who want to be counted as effective among other men. He sketched a distance, something near 300 yards, a number with authority, but also with swagger. He said enough that LeFors could later call it a confession, and that Horn could later call it boast and bluff. There are lines on the transcript that read like a man seeking credit in a small circle, best I ever made, and lines that read like a man speaking in riddles, because riddles are the safest way to talk when you are not sure who is listening. A court would have to decide which kind of man he was in that room. When Horn was arrested soon after, the 30-30 Winchester he carried became more than a tool. It became a character in its own right. Experts weighed it on the scales of 1902 knowledge and delivered opinions that have unraveled and reknotted ever since. Rifling marks were pointed to as fingerprints, then doubted as blurred echoes. Cartridge cases were read like palms, then set aside for lacking a clear lifeline. The rifle made a fine exhibit, and an exhibit makes a jury feel they are touching the story instead of just hearing it. Whether it connected the man to the shot by more than narrative force would be the question that outlived both rifle and man. Meanwhile, the Nickell and Miller families kept living in the aftermath. That is the part history rarely lingers on, too homely to dramatize and too heavy to ignore. Gates still needed hanging, sheep still needed moving, and there was the empty chair that goes on being empty after the neighbors stop bringing casseroles. A boy's death ripples outward in quiet ways, across a supper table, into how a father pulls on his boots, into whether a mother looks out a window twice instead of once before stepping onto the porch. The range is big enough to swallow a gunshot, but a family is small enough to hear the echo for years. In saloons from Cheyenne to Laramie, the talk settled into its grooves. Some said the West cannot be kept by the soft hands of courtrooms, only by men willing to do necessary things at necessary range, and that if a boy dies, it is the fault of those who brought sheep into cattle country and provoked hard answers. Others said that to hire a man to do murder and then to polish his work with big words like detective is a crime twice over, a theft of life first and of language next. The newspapers printed what they could get sworn to, dates, calibers, the fact of an arrest, and kept their editorials cautious. They had felt before how quickly a libel suit can ride a printing press into the ground. Horn spent the weeks between arrest and trial in the kind of limbo that hard men find unexpectedly difficult. Nothing to hunt, nothing to track, only lawyers in waiting. The cell gives a man time to inventory his convictions, and he had a tidy set. He believed in order, in warnings, in precision. He believed, perhaps most of all, in his own competence. It is the most dangerous belief a useful man can have, because it convinces him that the result justifies the means when the employer nods approval. Now the result had a boy's name, and the employer's nod could not be heard through stone walls. The country around Iron Mountain did not stop to consider the moral geometry. Winter came on. Sheep fed from stacks as the wind stripped them. Cattle slogged through drifts and nosed at ice. Men muttered about ballistics and transcripts, and whether a drunk confession is confession at all. A deputy wrote a letter to a friend saying the case was a tangle with a noose coiled in the middle of it. Somewhere along a ridge, a patch of trampled earth held its shape longer than tracks usually do, and then even that gave up to weather. In the court of public attention, which is quicker and crueler than any formal session, the verdict had already tilted. The official one would wait for spring. Between the fence line where Willie fell and the office where a man bragged toward his own end, the West displayed its full set of contradictions. Private power wearing the coat of public law, technology promising certainty it could not deliver, and grief taken up by partisans who would never have recognized each other as neighbors if not for the sound of a single shot. Whether Tom Horn had fired that shot or only claimed it, because claiming such things had become his way of holding himself upright, Wyoming now had a case that would teach it what kind of evidence a young state wanted to call justice. The answer would be written not on the ground, which forgets, but on paper, which does not. Spring in Cheyenne can't quite decide itself. Mud in the alleys, sun like a promise on courthouse steps. Tom Horn came to his trial through that weather, boots dull with the season, a prisoner who looked more like hired help than like a villain conjured by editorials. The building had that echo peculiar to rooms where verdicts are made. Boot heels, paper, the breath of men trying not to cough. Judge Richard H. Scott presided in a cool, exact voice. The county attorney, Walter Stahl, arranged his papers like a man who means to leave no crease in the story he's about to tell. Horn's counsel took their seats with the look of men already doing the arithmetic of a difficult case. A dead boy, a community divided, a defendant whose own tongue might yet prove the prosecution's best witness. Trials in young states have a dual audience, 12 in the box and a whole territory listening through the keyhole. Stoll opened by giving those audiences something solid to hold. Willie Nickell, 14, July 18, 1901, Iron Mountain, a rifle of .30-30 caliber, a feud deep enough to draw blood by daylight. He let the nouns do the first part of the hanging. Then he called his keystone, the conversation in Joe LeFors' office, with its stenographer in the next room and witnesses close enough to hear the glide and clink of glasses. The transcript arrived like an exhibit from a future age, typed, punctuated, tidy as a sermon. In it, a man bragged about a shot at near 300 yards, called it perhaps the best he'd ever made, and spoke in a way that folded skill and swagger until they were indistinguishable. Stoll did not need to name it a confession. He only needed the jurors to hear a man own the killing in the language of pride. The defense stood where such defenses must, on the uncertain ground between boast and admission. A drunk man talks large, a trapped man talks crooked. Which was Horn? They sketched a picture of a sting in which a professional braggart, warmed by whiskey and the wish to be hired, let his appetite for reputation outrun his sense. They asked the jury to hear cadence, not just content, to imagine the small male laughter of men showing each other their teeth because it passes for fellowship in rooms where work is rough and praise is rationed. They also went to work on the science, because the rifle matters in any story about a long shot, and the state had put one on the table. If the ballistics of 1902 were the close of certainty, they did not quite fit. Jurors were told of rifling marks and the way a bullet carries the cut of a barrel, the way a man carries his handwriting. They were shown the Winchester Model 1894 taken from Horn at arrest and invited to believe it had signed Willie's death as plainly as a name. The defense asked for humility in the face of metal, pointing out that barrels foul and clean, that bullets deform, that matching is a mixture of art and assertion, and that 30-30 Winchesters were as common in Wyoming as pocket knives. They reminded the jury that the first duty of proof is not to sound modern, but to be true. Around these keystones, a second play performed itself in whispers and in the jurors' private arithmetic. Politics. The cattle interests needed a solution that declared the range safe for business again. The sheepmen needed the law to say a boy's life could not be bargained away as the price of grazing in the wrong valley. Newspapers that had steered carefully during the investigation now painted in more confident lines because the presence of a jury acts like a kind of indemnity for strong adjectives. And yet for all the noise outside, the room itself stayed spare. Witnesses called, cross-examined, a diagram of the Nickell place chalked on a board, a deputy placing his hand on a Bible, and telling a truth passengers on the morning train would repeat by supper time as if they had always known it. There were moments that bent the air tight. A ranch wife, asked to recount the morning of the shot, lifted her eyes to a window invisible to everyone else, and paused long enough to make the gallery swallow. A gunsmith, when pressed past the margins of his expertise, admitted that certainty is a word judges like more than barrels do. A neighbor closed his testimony with the simple weight of a fact. A boy died. Such sentences do not move juries so much as they settle in them like silt, quiet and everywhere. If Horn had been born for cross-examination, he might have unstitched the transcript with his own voice, laid bare the performance of that office talk, explained the male ritual of claiming deeds you did not do, because to deny them would be to admit a smaller kind of weakness. But he was built for distance, not for rooms. On the stand and off, he could be both courteous and opaque, a combination that makes later historians tear their hair and contemporaries lose patience. He maintained a soldier's posture about the one thing he would not say plainly. If he had not fired the shot, then who had? The defense hinted elsewhere, to men in the feud with more direct cause, to the chaos of a district that made enemies like thunderstorms do, but hints are poor substitutes for names when a jury has been taught to love nouns. The verdict showed how much theater matters. The jurors, 12 ordinary Wyoming men, found the transcript persuasive enough, the rifle close enough, and the man in the chair dangerous enough that doubt could not quite seat itself among them. Guilty. The word had no adjectives, only a temperature drop. Horn took it as a man might take weather, braced and expressionless, then asked for the motions that are both ritual and overruled. New trial, reconsideration, mercy. While the appeals worked their slow gears, the gallows was made ready, and with it a piece of machinery the newspapers could not stop describing. The Julian device, water-powered, is a contraption as Western as a windmill and as grim as a mortician's ledger. A bucket fills through a narrow throat, and when the weight is right, a valve trips. The trap drops not by a human hand at a lever, but by gravity doing what it does. The theory was that such a machine purified responsibility, as if nature itself had rendered the sentence. Men love to put their guilt at a distance, even from the edge of a platform. In the last months, Horn wrote letters, some to friends with money and backbone, like John C. Cobble, who had stood up his defense and would later gather Horn's reminiscences into the volume that helped turn a working life into a legend. Some to loved ones, some to nobody in particular, simply setting down the grammar of a man considering ends. He read newspapers and knew the terms in which strangers were arranging him. Range detective or hired killer, instrument of order or murderer with a business card. He watched the law make a road out of days, each leading into the next with the unexcitable logic of a stock drive. If he felt fear, he did not accessorize it. November 20th, 1903 came cold and bright, the kind of blue that steals depth from the sky. The Cheyenne jail yard gathered its actors, sheriff, doctor, clergy, witnesses, a few men whose curiosity could not be satisfied by print. Horn walked with that loose-kneed cowboy stride that ignores constraints until the last possible second. There are versions that put a cigar between his teeth, versions that hand him last words, some steady, some bitter, most unconfirmable. The ones that matter are simple, that he maintained his innocence of killing the boy and that he held himself together. On the platform, the mechanics were explained as if the lesson might improve the outcome. The rope was measured, the knot placed just so, the bucket began to drink. There is always a long moment in such devices when everyone alive strains to hear time passing. It is the only sound that matters. When the trap fell, it did so with the heavy finality of policy. A doctor stepped forward to count out the minutes required by decorum and circulatory stubbornness. When it was done, men looked at the boards of the scaffold as if they could find absolution in the grain. Afterward, Cheyenne returned itself to errands. Telegrams sent, edits composed, the thumbnail histories that appear overnight in city papers back east. The appeals were moot, the governor, acting governor Fenimore Chatterton, having refused clemency, the sentence carried out in full. Somewhere on the Nickell place, the winter chores did not shrink to make room for closure. Somewhere in a cattleman's office, a manager believed his range safer. Somewhere in Brown's Park, a woman who had lost her man 3 years earlier read the story and felt nothing new. The law had spoken, and the West had heard it in the usual way. As one more wind moving across a grass sea where meanings lie down behind rocks until the riders are gone. If a man is only what the last court says he is, then Tom Horn was a murderer. If a man is the shape of the work he was hired to do, then he was the tool of an order that preferred the whistle of a long shot to the uncertainties of juries and sheriffs. In that gap between labels, the legend took hold, because legends thrive best where archives have edges and lives resist tidy nouns. The execution ended a body. It did not end the argument. That, like the wind that keeps coming even when no one is left to feel it, would go on. History is never just what happened. It is also what we decide to remember, and who gets to do the deciding. Tom Horn died on a clear November morning, and in the silence that followed, men with pens and payrolls, widows with long memories, and historians with careful hands all reached for the same life. They found not a straight trail but switchbacks, soldier and scout, detective and deterrent, necessary man or unforgivable one. The file closes in Cheyenne. The story keeps writing. The first strong hand on the legend belonged to John C. Cobble, Horn's steadfast friend and sometime employer. Cobble gathered Horn's letters, dictated recollections, and field diaries and, in 1904, put them between covers as Life of Tom Horn, Government Scout, and Interpreter. It is a book that knows its audience and its purpose. Here Horn is the professional, a man patient enough to trail Apache scouts through the Sierra Madre without hatred and competent enough to keep pack trains moving through Cuban mud. The range work is framed as duty, the killing as context, the voice tidy, masculine, unrepentant. Autobiography is always a contortion. The writer must look backward while bracing his self-respect forward. Horn's pages do that trick with a craftsman's economy. They also omit what would make the argument harder. Silences around Brown's Park, ellipses at Iron Mountain, absences as eloquent as any paragraph. Museums and auction rooms added their verses to the ballad. The Winchester Model 1894, 3030 taken from Horn at arrest, has toured glass cases and glossy catalogs like a relic. Its walnut glow and blued steel bearing provenance tags as if a chain of owners could substitute for certainty. People crowd such exhibits the way they crowd a battlefield overlook. They want a vantage point on violence without danger. A rifle in a case is a safe version of a hard truth, that power in Horn's day, as in any day, is most legible at the end of a barrel, and least accountable there. A placard can list calibers and serial numbers. It cannot describe the silence after a single distant shot, or the way a family closes ranks around a kitchen table, because the world has offered them no other defense. The science that convicted Horn never quite hardened into fact. The court in 1902 had rifling marks in conviction. It did not yet have the full 20th century toolkit. Comparison microscopes, standardized protocols, the disciplined skepticism that comes after too many laboratories have learned the velocity of their own certainties. Later scholars would read the transcripts with a cool eye and call the ballistics ambitious for their time and insufficient by later measures. As for the LeFors interview, the stenographic record feels modern in its neatness and old in its ethics. A man drunk or near enough, lured with promises, speaking in bravado and riddles to a friendly ear, he did not realize had a second audience in the next room. Legal standards have since grown elaborate about custodial statements. In Horne's day, the law wore plainer clothes and took plainer liberties. There is an oddness in watching procedure evolve while grief remains the same size. Brown's Park, too, began to resist the simpler versions. For years, local lore repeated that Isom Dart had once been Ned Huddleston, born enslaved in Arkansas, and later notorious as an outlaw before trying the straight life in the valley. Later dives into county records and regional histories called that linkage mistaken, a myth sutured to a life by the press of race and romance. Dart emerges more clearly in newer tellings as a Texas-born hand of exceptional skill whose reputation for rustling may have been a mask laid on him by enemies or by the shorthand of a hard place. What does not change is how he died, to a hidden rifle, and how the valley felt lighter in numbers and heavier in fear afterward. The stock detective explains it one way. The families who packed their bedding by lamplight explain it another. In larger frame, Horne's life sits in a system that preferred private enforcement to public ambiguity. Stock growers' associations assessed their members for protection. Railroads hired Pinkertons to find what sheriffs could not. Foreign capital, Scottish and English, flowed through ranch empires like Swan Land Cattle and expected frontier uncertainties to be reduced to spreadsheet margins. The Johnson County invasion of 1892 had shown the danger of spectacle. The following decade perfected the art of quiet outcomes. Horne's method, warning first, range next, silence last, furnished exactly that kind of result. If he was a villain with clients. If he was a guardian, he guarded property first and peace as a welcome side effect. The dispute over his character is really a dispute over whose safety counts. Time did not soften the quarrel. In 1993, a mock retrial in Wyoming, new judge, modern rules of evidence, no man's life at stake, returned a verdict of not guilty. That experiment did not empty the nickel chair at supper, nor did it populate Brown's Park with families who had left in 1900, but it reminded the state that doubt grows in the spaces where old methods reach beyond their proof. The retrial lives on less as jurisprudence than as theater of conscience, a way for a community to rehearse its values aloud. It also shows how we use the past to answer present hunger, for certainty, for fairness, for the belief that our great-grandfathers would have agreed with us if only they'd had our tools. Meanwhile, the cultural West kept Horne busy. Films, paperbacks, and documentary hours cast him and recast him because the type he represents is perennially employable. The range detective who brings order with a long shot when the law is weak, or the hired killer. The law quietly tolerates when the clients are strong. Storytellers love such men because they carry the audience toward a question without ever answering it. Does necessity sanctify what it pays for, or does it only normalize it? When a writer puts a cigar in Horne's mouth on the scaffold and gives him last words honed to a frontier shine, understand that the writer is telling you more about now than about then. Legends are mirrors with dust on them. You see what you bring. There is another afterlife more prosaic and maybe more honest. The archives. County ledgers in Cheyenne and bags. Court minutes with ink blotted by a clerk's hurry. Military correspondence from the Crawford Affair, bound in volumes that smell of paste and cloth. In those rooms, the myth's temperature drops. You find per diem vouchers, horse exchanges, telegrams with misspellings that make them human, and letters from ranch managers complaining in exact sums. How many calves branded? How many strays recovered? How much detective fees still due? You also find statements from women who knew the men we argue about. Small, exact sentences about mornings, about which cup he used, and whether he fixed the damn door the week before he died. The ordinary details are what the past leaves behind when the biggest words have blown away. Some truths hold whatever lens you use. Willie Nickell, 14, was shot and fell on July 18, 1901. Matt Rash and Isom Dart were ambushed in 1900 after warning notes went up in Brown's Park. A man named Tom Horne worked for powerful outfits and believed he was doing a hard job in a hard land. He died by a water-powered gallows on November 20, 1903, saying he hadn't killed the boy. Around those stones, the arguments swirl about ballistics and boasts, about a state's right to peace, and a corporation's appetite for it, about whether the frontier was tamed by law or by men who worked around it at a price agreed in back rooms. Stand on a rise anywhere the high grass leans and you can still feel the script running underneath your boots. The wind keeps its old habit of combing the land for loose things, voices, cartridges, names. In that sound, you might hear Horn as he heard the world. Distances to be solved, problems to be warned and then erased. Or you might hear the other track, the voices that never got louder than a cabin's walls, the families that left quietly because the valley had grown noisy with fear. The West is not finished with either music. It was built by men who insisted that order and freedom could be made to share a fence line, and by the cost paid whenever that fence cut someone in two. So what do we call him, finally, at the end of the ledger? Range detective, the phrase a manager chooses when the board expects an accounting. Hired killer, the name a widow gives a distant flash and a single crack of sound. Perhaps the frontier's clearest verdict is the most uncomfortable one. He was the shape of his employer's needs. The rest of us have argued ever since because we are still deciding which needs we are willing to pay for with other people's lives and from how far away. That question, like the wind, does not quit the country. It crosses fences, drifts into towns, and waits on courthouse steps each spring, asking whether justice is a word for what the law can prove or a word for what the powerful can purchase. Tom Horn's life is the ridgeline where those definitions met. Look long enough, and you can see how steep both sides are.